All right, everyone, we'll get started. And as people enter, I'll go ahead and just let them in. Um, and this is also being recorded, so it'll be shared out as well. So if there's any parts that someone misses, or if any of you here want to share that with somebody later on, I will have a link that is sent out to everyone via email, and it'll also be on our social media pages where you can share out this information that we're going over today. So I want to thank you all for joining us this tonight, late afternoon. It's not quite tonight. Um, we're going to be going over a webinar that is focused on the Anchorage Public Safety Commission and the Assembly Ordinance 2026-62, which is regarding the creation or reimagination of the Anchorage Public Safety Commission. While this ordinance is being presented as a step towards accountability, tonight we discuss the limitations of the proposal, especially the fact that the commission would only have advisory powers and no investigative authority. And we will go in kind of deeper into what that looks like as we go through the slides. Sorry, I should introduce myself. My name is Cynthia Gauchipane. I am the Executive Director of Empowerment Advocate Alaska. I have been working with MMIP and officer-involved families for roughly 6 years, going on 7 years now. And I work in direct services with families. So the services that we provide at Empowerment Advocate are ones in which if a family comes to us with some concerns about an MMIP case for their loved one or an officer-involved shooting case for their loved one, I work directly with them to navigate the systems that are set before them, that they have to kind of go through the processes with APD, with the municipality, with the state, and I just help navigate that with them. And also I tailor my services based on family needs. So it really is a flexible kind of direct service support due to it being tailored to each individual family. But overall, we stay to like a standard process of how we help. And if there are certain things that we don't do, such as housing assistance, for example, is one of the things we don't do, what we will do then is refer out for some of the resources in the community that could help with those things. But other than that, we are very hands-on at Empowerment Advocate Alaska. We work one-on-one with families and we navigate things that are very difficult for them so that they don't have to do that on their own. So our first slide is going over why we're having this conversation, why it matters. So in Anchorage and throughout the state, but today we're focusing specifically on Anchorage due to the ordinance that's coming up. Families are asking for real accountability in MMIP and officer-involved shooting cases. MMIP and officer-involved shooting families have, for many, many years, called for transparency with APD, medical examiner's office, some of the state offices as well. Accountability, particularly with officers involved in some of these cases, and also the Department of Anchorage Police Department as a whole. Independent oversight, which we'll go into that a little bit more in a few more slides. Fair investigations, and community trust in APD. Families for many years now have hoped for civilian oversight, which is independent oversight, civilian oversight go usually hand in hand. We have been working towards creating an independent review and investigative power review board for many years, since about 2020. And what we are being proposed right now is an advisory body, and our concern is that that is just not going to really be what the community needs and wants. And we'll go over why that is the case. In this slide, I go over some of the general complaint processes that we have for APD when families come to me. Right now, we have 3 standard ways to make a complaint for, let's say, an MMIP case, an officer-involved shooting case, a form of officer misconduct if the person is still living and they have been treated in a unfair way by, let's say, an officer, and they want to make a complaint. One of the first things I have families do is make the Anchorage Police Department complaint process. It is an online form. It's really actually pretty simple form to do. I usually will do that for the families or do that side by side with the families. And what ends up happening is that complaint goes to Anchorage Police Department's internal affairs. And then they investigate themselves. Basically, APD will investigate themselves for that complaint made against either their officer or their department. You can also make a complaint with the Anchorage Ombudsman, and I'll kind of go over what that looks like. So with the Anchorage Ombudsman, they will review the complaints involving municipal governments or departments. So they'll review a complaint against the Anchorage Police Department specifically. They can review it, kind of look at whatever the complaint is, have a conversation with usually leadership within APD about the complaint. I mean, that's the hope, I guess, is that they're doing that. That is what they should be doing. And then based on what they've gathered between your complaint and their conversations, and maybe some a little bit of minimal investigative processes to kind of see what that problem was and how it occurred. They can then make recommendations. And that's the limit there, is that it is just a recommendation. APD does not have to implement that in any way. So they don't have any direct disciplinary authority over APD. They can just simply say, hey, for example, I'll use a misconduct complaint. Somebody has complained about being treated with excessive force. We looked over the case, we looked over some of the information, and we decided that it does look like excessive force was done towards this individual. And then at that point, they can make a recommendation of, let's say, more training. And this is all hypothetical. This is not a case that I'm speaking about directly, but then that recommendation can be made. But that doesn't mean that APD actually has to move forward with that recommendation. So that's kind of the issue there with that complaint process. You can also make a complaint to the Alaska Police Standards Council. And what they do there is they review officer certification and misconduct concerns. So that would be, if you had a specific officer that you have a concern about for, let's say, excessive force, an officer-involved shooting case, they would look at that officer specifically. The processes for making this complaint can actually be a little bit difficult to navigate. And along with the Anchorage Police Department complaint, I also usually will do this for my clients, or I'll do it with them so that they don't have to navigate a really complex system. The issue being with this complaint process is the action is often limited or rarely visible to families, so you may not hear what the real outcome of that situation is once you make the complaint. So I always tell families that even though these 3 complaint processes generally don't end up with anything that is going to be sufficient for their needs, that they should still make these complaints. I still walk them through how to do all of the complaints, and I do think that making the complaints is something that families and individuals should do, because then you are putting it on record that these things transpired to you or your family member. I also say with the understanding to them that there will most likely be nothing to come from the complaints, but it is still good to have it on record that the complaint was made. And so this leads into the ordinance that's coming up, because this would technically be a 4th way to make a complaint if the commission is approved on the 26th. So what AO 2026-62 proposes, the ordinance would create a commission that reviews public safety concerns, makes recommendations, advises leadership. So that would be, say, advising the Anchorage Police Department chief case, also the mayor, and then encourages community discussion. They have had several community discussions when they were in the reimagining phase of this commission. My understanding is that they will continue to have these conversations if the commission is approved. I don't know what that will look like. That's just what was written down in there in the ordinance. So now there's the but. So what's the problem, right? Because all of that doesn't sound bad, right? Like that actually, nothing about that sounds like we would necessarily be against it. And I would say, yeah, I mean, I'm not against reviewing public safety concerns or making recommendations or advising leadership or having community discussion. But and this is a big but, here are where the issues come, is that they cannot independently investigate complaints. So they basically are very similar to the ombudsman in that, is they may get a complaint from a family, but they cannot just hear about a situation, let's say an officer involved shooting, and decide on their own to go forward and investigate that. Or they may hear about an MMIP case where there seems to be some concerns. They on their own are not going to be able to go in and independently investigate that. It would have to be brought to them. They cannot subpoena records. That's also a big issue there. So they're not going to be able to see all the evidence, basically. And that's a concern, because if some information is withheld and it's pertinent information that and they're looking into a complaint, they're not going to be able to make a full, well-rounded decision on that complaint if they don't have all that information. They cannot discipline officers, so they have no authority to, let's say, fire an officer, to put an officer on leave, anything of that nature. And then they cannot force policy changes. So they can make, as it says above, they can make recommendations to APD, but they cannot say, here's what we want to see due to all these complaints we've had about this particular situation that consistently happens, and we want these, this policy change so we don't have this problem anymore. They cannot do that under the proposed ordinance that's coming up. So just kind of to know, this is one of the most important parts of tonight's conversation. The proposed commission, it's just advisory. That means it can make suggestions, but it has no authority to independently investigate complaints or require action from the Anchorage Police Department or municipal leadership. And that's where, as a community, we see that gap in, there's a problem, we want to see it fixed, and we're told it can't be fixed, or we're not told anything at all sometimes. It just kind of depends. But it's not sufficient, is basically where I'm getting at. We already have the 3 other complaint processes that I showed in the previous slide. This is actually pretty similar to what we already have in place. So it doesn't really, to most of us, it doesn't make sense to add in a 4th process where we're not going to see actual outcomes that are going to be helpful to our community in a real way. So advisory versus investigative oversight. This kind of just shows you what is the difference. So advisory oversight, it gives recommendations, has limited authority, relies on departments to cooperate. That's where the subpoena power comes in. They're relying on, if they wanted some form of, let's say, body camera footage, they would have to rely on APD complying with them to get that. So the department has to cooperate with the commission. And then they cannot enforce any outcomes that they see fit. So if they wanted a policy change, they can't enforce that. If they feel that an officer should be fired due to his conduct, they cannot enforce that. Investigative oversight conducts independent investigations, so it can actually, like I said, see something happening in the community, see that the community is being concerned, and maybe a complaint hasn't been brought to them, but they can be proactive with that situation and say, hey, we're noticing that this looks like a repetitive pattern, and the community is also noticing this, and we are just going to go ahead and independently look into this, which is what we would want for a commission, is to be able to have that power. They review evidence directly, so they have that subpoena power. They don't have to hope on cooperation from anybody to get that information. They have stronger transparency tools because they are doing an investigative oversight, so they can be very transparent with the community, and it creates greater accountability for officers, for departments. When we are actually looking at the situation as a whole and they have the power to do so, that is what accountability that's what we need to have accountability. So one of the things I want to mention here is that there are a variety of this is kind of seen as civilian oversight as a broader term. And there are a lot of varieties of civilian oversight throughout the nation. I'm a member of of NACOL, which is the National Association of Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement. And this is what that organization does specifically, is it looks at communities who want civilian oversight, and they build basically a plan for a community to go forward with. They work with the community, they work with the different departments. So law enforcement, the city, all of these different elements come into play. But most importantly, they work with the community, they work with families, they work with victims, and they come up with a plan that actually fits what the community is asking for. And we have had NACOL do a few webinar meetings here in Alaska, I would say between 2022, 2023 till recently. And I believe they actually did one with the reimagining Anchorage Public Safety Committee task force. They did one with them, I believe, at one point as well. The concern that, I would say that I have as someone who works in victim services is that NACOL does see the community for its needs, and it doesn't appear that the municipality wants to fully listen to those recommendations, and also did not hire them. So what we see now with the ordinance is not something that comes out of NACOL. That was, they just, I believe, had like a meeting with them that was public. But bringing on a organization like NACOL and actually having them look at our community and look at our issues and mapping out a plan for us would have been the best use of our money, because they did spend about $40,000 on this reimagining committee that they had. And we definitely could have used that for professionals to come in and make a plan for us that most likely would have fit the needs for what we had wanted here. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. And that is why we have, in my opinion, I should say, the advisory oversight versus the investigative oversight. And I can answer more on that too at the end if you guys have questions on that. Sorry, that is not the right one. So, oversight without power. So can accountability exist without enforcement? That's really the question, right? Can we have accountability if we don't have any form of enforcement behind our complaint processes? And the key concerns here for the advisory commission would be that it has no subpoena authority. It has no independent investigation authority. There's no disciplinary authority, no guaranteed policy changes, and no direct control over complaint outcomes. So looking at those concerns, I would say, yes, we are looking at a process that they're bringing up to us with this ordinance that is not entirely, awful, but it isn't hitting any of these key concerns. And so will we really end up with accountability when when a complaint is moved forward by a family member or a victim of officer misconduct? Oversight bodies are often most effective when they have authority to independently review evidence, compel cooperation, and publicly report findings. Without these powers, we have to question whether meaningful oversight is something that can actually happen. So here are the questions the community should be asking. And this is specific to the ordinance 2026-62. So what happens if recommendations that the commission makes are ignored? What happens, right? Nothing is the answer. Nothing will happen because they're advisory. How will transparency be guaranteed? Which is what the community has been asking for quite a while. We want to know, obviously within reason, we don't want to violate anybody's confidentiality of victims or their surviving family members. There obviously should be a victim-centered mind frame or mindset when you're giving transparency and accountability. With that being said, you can do a victim-centered process that is transparent. There is a way to do that. So, how will transparency be guaranteed? It won't be. Why are there no investigative powers? And that would be a question to ask at the assembly meeting, is why did they go towards advisory versus investigative when it was clear that the community wanted investigative powers, when it was clear that even in some of the initial recommendations, the task force seemed to want investigative powers as well, or maybe not everyone on the task force, but some did. And the question there is, why did we end up with an advisory when it was pretty clear that that is not what we wanted? And that would, like I said, be a question to ask the assembly or put forth to them. So what accountability mechanisms exist with this advisory commission? And they haven't been very clear on that. So that's also another question that can be asked to the assembly is, how do they plan to hold officers accountable or APD accountable when a complaint is processed through and found to be valid? How are they going to make sure that that officer, let's say, is no longer on the force if he has committed, multiple misconduct issues? How will families know their concerns matter? Which is also another thing that was not very clear in this ordinance, is how that follow up with families will look like. They were very vague in the ordinance, and when I send out the email of this webinar, I'll add the ordinance link as well, so you all can look at that yourselves. But most of it was very vague, and that's a big concern, is when there's vagueness within anything that should hold transparency and accountability, we should question that, because being vague means that they don't actually have to follow through in the way that the community wants them to. So as the Anchorage Assembly prepares to vote, we should carefully examine what this ordinance actually does and also what it doesn't do. Public oversight only works when communities clearly understand the powers and limitations involved. And so we should ask them to be very clear with some of these questions here. public testimony, and community action. So how can we speak up? There's a variety of ways that members in the community can speak up and can engage with this ordinance. You can attend the assembly hearing, which is on Tuesday. You can submit public testimony, and you can do that in person at the meeting. You can do it over the phone as well. You can also email your assembly member or members. So you can, and that's that third bullet point is contact assembly members. I will send in the email as well the contact for assembly members if that's something you choose to do. You can share your family experiences if you're an MMIP or officer involved shooting surviving family member and you want to do public testimony or send an email to assembly members. And I highly recommend families that are in this position share their experiences because, and I wouldn't say, going super in depth to some of them if it doesn't feel comfortable to you, of course. But I think some general concerns they're going to be taken much more seriously when they come from families and when they come from victims than they would from the general public who was not directly impacted by APD, misconduct, MMIP, or officer involved shooting cases with Anchorage Police Department. And then advocate for stronger oversight powers, which is what you can do by giving your testimony or submitting your email, is asking that we have a investigative commission versus an advisory one. So the upcoming assembly hearing we have is going to be at the Lusac Library. So that's the Midtown Library. It'll be on Tuesday, May 26th. The assembly meeting starts at 5 p.m. I always like to warn people when they go that these assembly meetings can go all the way to about midnight. So there could be quite a wait. I just want to forewarn anybody if they plan to go. They are quite long. They're discussing several other issues as well at the assembly meeting. So, and they can also move items around. So even if which I will send out what the agenda is for the assembly, even if the item is for this ordinance is higher up on the list, if they choose to move it down further, they can do that. And that would not be uncommon. The assembly often does that, which is, my personal opinion, not great to do to the community because we are there to give testimony. And if we have to wait till 10 or 11 p.m. to do so, some people have to leave because they have work, they have families, they have responsibilities they need to get to, and that it directly impacts public testimony at times. But I do like to give people that warning beforehand, is that they may be there for quite some time. If you get there at 5, you might not leave till midnight, unfortunately. Public testimony will help shape the conversation around AO 2026-62 and the future of public safety oversight in Anchorage. So if enough people are speaking out about this ordinance and lacking investigative powers and other issues that they might have concern with once they read the ordinance, if enough people are bringing that to the assembly, the hope then is that the assembly relooks at this and says, if the community has these issues and there's quite a few community members voicing these concerns, then maybe we need to kind of look this over once more. And hopefully, as I always say, hopefully is my go-to, they will decide that the advisory commission is not enough, that the community wants something stronger. And hopefully they will give the community what we are asking for. Just to kind of close out on that, this ordinance, I know, has not been spoken a lot in terms of like the media hasn't had a lot of coverage of it. I know the community hasn't been super aware of it. My opinion is that there's a reason why that is the case. because if enough of us come to the meeting and we vocalize our concerns, they have to hear us out. And they may have to change something, and they may not want to do that. So it's really important that as a community, we're involved with this particular ordinance and many others as well. For Empowerment Advocate Alaska, anything that has to do with public safety, victim services, MMIP, officer involved shootings, officer misconduct, because of the services that we provide, we really want to be involved in these, and we really want the community to know what is happening with these ordinances when they come before the assembly or when they're being developed, because we see it as the only way that those that are directly impacted by these ordinances, which also, to keep into consideration, some of us may not be currently impacted, but that doesn't mean that we wouldn't potentially be impacted in the future. We really want to see that the community voice is heard. And I know from my work for many years that the community wants transparency and accountability. We've repeated that for many, many years, because these are our loved ones, these are our family members, these are people that we care about that are being impacted by poor policies. And we can make that change if as a community we come together and really push for it. So to end on that, and I will take some questions if there is any. This is just my contact information. You can reach me on email. You can call us directly. We have our website, which goes over all the different services we provide in detail. We also have Facebook and Instagram. You can follow us on Facebook or Instagram or both, where we try to keep up to date with what's happening in Anchorage and throughout the state as well. So when it comes to the services that we provide, so that the community can know what's going on and be aware of any concerns. And I will end it there. If anybody has any questions, I can definitely take them.